Black history is Black horror. This is the No Fear podcast. We know what scares you.
I'm Matt.
I am Mel.
And I'm Lisa.
And this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is the 8th episode of Season 7. Today, we are discussing another master of horror and one of our favorites, Tananrive Due.
For our seventh season, we have been talking about some of the big names in horror. We kicked this season off by talking about Peter Straub. We followed that up with some talk about Stephen King. I'm surprised it took us that long to talk about him, just that in depth, but it did. And we thought we would kind of keep the ball rolling by talking about somebody else who has made quite an impact on the horror genre, and that is Tananrive Due. Now, Tananrive Due has been writing for quite a long time, but she's still very much, I think, making a mark in the genre today. In fact, the NAACP Image Awards recently announced their nominations for Outstanding Literary Work. And The Keeper by Tananrive Due and Stephen Barnes was on that list. So it was joined by several of other really great works. But it's quite cool to see Tananrive Due still kind of making an impact. So I'm just going to give you a little overview, a little biography of her life, not too much in depth, but just a little bit. So she was born in Tallahassee, Florida. Florida actually figures pretty prominently in a lot of her stories and novels. That's one of her strengths, I think, is being able to evoke a particular place. In this case, Florida, she does really well. She's the oldest of three daughters and was born to civil rights activist Patricia Stevens Due, and her father was John D. Due Jr., who was a civil rights lawyer. She earned a BS in journalism from Northwestern University. She has a master's in English literature. I think she focused on Nigerian literature in particular. From the University of Leeds. She's married to Stephen Barnes, who is sometimes her co-author. He's an author in and of himself who writes science fiction, fantasy, mystery. Together, they've written scripts for television, screenplays. They've done some short fiction together, some comic books. And she met him at Clark Atlanta University while she was on a panel for the African American Fantastic Imagination. They live in Los Angeles right now. And she has been working as a writer and as a faculty member at a university there where she works with the MFA program. So a few things about Due that you may have heard about. She figured very prominently in the 2019 documentary Horror Noir, A History of Black Horror, which was produced by Shudder and Jordan Peele. If you haven't seen Horror Noir, I highly, highly recommend it. It is a really great look at the history of Black horror. But she also taught a course at UCLA called The Second Place, which was about the Black horror history, Black horror aesthetic. And that first course, when it came out, went viral, which is not very often that a university class goes viral. But this one did because Jordan Peele made an unannounced, or I guess she knew about it, but unannounced to the students' visit. So he was sitting in the back of the classroom and they were talking about the film Get Out. And of course, that's where she got the course title from. But they were talking about, Black horror, how racism kind of plays into that, the history of it, all sorts of, themes and things. And he did a kind of pop up in the class. And if I remember right, he was kind of wearing a hoodie and like pushed it back and revealed himself, and everybody screamed when they realized that Jordan Peele was sitting in their class. So that's just kind of a fun look where also you might know her from, because I feel like a lot of people, I'm surprised. Well, I'll just say this. I am surprised that her name does not come up more when people talk about horror being written today. But before we kind of turn it over to our discussion, here are a few things that you may have read. She wrote a book called The Between, 1995. Now, I've heard some rumors that The Between is being developed by her and her husband, or at least they're involved for a TV adaptation. I don't know where that's at right now. And I think that's been something that has kind of been in the works for a while and has kind of gone in and out. So hopefully one day we'll see that. She wrote 2003's novel The Good House, which is one of my favorites. It's an excellent haunted house book. She has the African Immortal series, which started with My Soul to Keep. That's came out in 1997. There's, I believe, 4 books in that series. She's written a lot of short stories. I highly recommend her collection Ghost Summer, which came out in 2015 and has some of my favorite short stories in there. And she's won several Bram Stoker awards, including for The Between and My Soul to Keep, an NAACP Image Award, which again, she's already been nominated for another one. She's won an American Book Award for The Living Blood, a British Fantasy Award, an Ignite Award for her creative nonfiction Black Horror Rising, which was published in Uncanny Magazine. I could probably keep going on, but that would take up the entirety of this podcast. So I'm going to just stop right there. She's also, I will say, has written some television episodes as well. And I think some of hers came out in the new, I want to say the new Creep Show, but that may be wrong. I don't have that note directly in front of me, but I know she has done some of the new horror, maybe the new Twilight Zone that Jordan Peele worked on. But she has written some television as well. So that is Tananrive Due in a nutshell. I know I went through that very fast, but I'm very curious. I've already mentioned some of my favorites. Matt, Mel, what are your thoughts about Tananrive Due? What's some of the favorite things that you've read? What's your history with her?
I guess I'll go first here. I'm sorry to say, when I think back on my history with Tananrive Due's work, I wish that I had known of her earlier, and I'm kind of surprised that I didn't. I'm a person who's read a lot of African American literature, and I also liked supernatural and horror stuff. And it wasn't until I think it was around the time that Ghost Summer, the collection, came out, and I believe that would have been like 2014 or 15. I was driving in my car and listening to a book podcast, as I want to do, and the people on the podcast were talking about this new book by this writer, Tananrive Due. And I was like, this book sounds amazing, because I mean, I love ghosts and I love ideas of short story collections tied together by place, which there's about a third of Ghost Summer that takes place in the town in her fictional town in Florida where the ghost stories take place. And I'm thinking of Zora Neale Hurston when I'm hearing them talk about these stories. And I'm just like, this is just so fascinating. I have to get this. And so, I mean, I think it was probably that day when I got home, I ordered a copy of Ghost Summer because I wanted to read it. And once I read it, I just went down a rabbit hole of trying to find other things. And I think it's interesting because I think, Tananarive Due is a really interesting character because she has been, in African American literature, she has been writing for a long time and publishing for a while. And yet I kind of feel like maybe the reason I hadn't heard her name was because I was taking classes as an undergraduate and a graduate student in literature. And so things that a commercial audience would consider horror may have not been included, which is really weird because, again, if you look at her in the history, she was publishing around the time of folks who are doing supernatural and magical realism stuff like Randall Keenan, Tina McElroy Anza, or if you think of even more commercial folks like L.A. Banks, I think might have been published around the same time. Um, Dews also said that part of the reason she started writing supernatural fiction and thought it could be published is because she read Gloria Naylor's Mama Day, which is like one of the most awesome books ever. And I feel like I got to shout that out too. So she is just steeped and integrated into this tradition. And yet I feel like this is one of those situations where, because she's considered a genre writer, she was not included in book lists that I was getting and things that I was talking with my professors about. So I'm so happy that in the last several years I've been able to rectify the situation, because I feel like her writing is right in kind of my interest area of what a writer can do dealing with history and hauntings. She famously said in an interview that was published in, I believe it was African American Review, that her two inspirations when she first started writing were Toni Morrison and Stephen King. And she said other students in this class she was in were taken aback by that. They were like, Toni Morrison, cool, but we don't know what else, what's going on there. And, I feel like when I read The Good House in particular, and when I read the novella Ghost Summer and Ghost Summer, I'm like, oh my gosh, I totally see the influence of how Toni Morrison was thinking about the interplay between personal history, cultural history, American history, and the idea of what one can do with hauntings and what one can do with non-Western and non-Eurocentric spiritual traditions and religions as well. And then, of course, you've got Stephen King, because she's like, I just want to scare the pants off people while I'm doing it. And I also want to say for folks, if you like Stephen King and you liked what we did with him as a master of horror, I recently listened to the Losers podcast, March 2019 episode, where Tananrive Due and Stephen Barnes were asked about Stephen King's influence on them and their relationship with him and playing music with him. And so if you're interested in these folks and the interplay between their work, I highly recommend checking that out. But yeah, that's kind of my history with her. I feel like I wish that past Mel had been introduced to her in an academic setting, but I understand that that's not always going to happen, and you can't read everything and be aware of everything. But I'm so happy that I've become more aware of her work, because I've read so much. I've read her memoir for her mom, Freedom in the Family, and I read The Keeper as soon as it came out, and I've now read The Between and My Soul to Keep, and I'm trying to get through the Immortal series. And so I'm happy that I've been able to in the last few years have the joy of working through all this. But I kind of wish I'd heard about her earlier. And I have to say, I've now taught her work in a couple classes to kind of show students like what's going on in the contemporary moment and how genre plays a role in what we normally think of as the canon. So I feel like in a way, like she's become kind of important to me as a personally as a reader, but also kind of professionally in the way I look at how we just represent writing in general, what gets taught and what doesn't, and how we need to revisit that.
Well, Mel, I feel like I couldn't have said it better myself, wishing that I had come across Tananarive Due sooner. I believe I probably first heard her mentioned by you and Lisa, actually, at some point, if I recall right. So it was probably your reading Ghost Summer that even had her name come across my radar. And I've I have to say, I mean, I wish that I had found her stuff sooner, because she's just such a fantastic writer. And I mean, like My Soul to Keep. I mean, that was published in, I think Lisa said it was 97. So I mean, I could have had so long with reading that. And I don't know. I've always tried to keep up at least with contemporary things that are coming out. So I don't even know. I don't have an excuse. At least after I finished grad school back in the middle 2000s, which that's a surprisingly long time ago now. But that's neither here nor there. My real experience with hers, I have read the first two of the African Immortal series, and I I really like them. I want to read the rest of them, but I've gotten sidetracked by other new things that have been coming out. I've actually been reading those recently, but got sidetracked by some newer things that have also been pre-published lately. But I think that comparison of inspiration coming from both Toni Morrison and Stephen King, I can completely see. I feel like her her grasp of characters and character development, that's one thing that I've always felt like Stephen King has truly excelled at. Sometimes his stories are a little hokey, sometimes his he doesn't stick the landing, and the ending of the books is not great, but his characters are great, and I feel like she definitely has that with the things I've read by her. But also I it I'm struggling to put my finger on, like, it's on the tip of my tongue, but I can absolutely see her in the same breath as Toni Morrison and Zora Neale Hurston. Like, thematically, she's right there with both of them as well. So I'm so glad you mentioned that she herself said that as her two influences, because I 100% can see that in her work.
One thing that I was thinking of that really struck me while y'all were talking, Mel, especially you, when you brought up like Stephen King as being one of her early influences on her writing, and just thinking about like the things that she deals with in her writing and the themes, Matt, kind of to your point, that she does. Like I mentioned settings, for instance, and that's one of the things that really stands out to me when I read her work. Is it I always feel so entrenched in like whatever place she's writing about. And a lot of times it is the South. You know, a lot of times she does write about Florida, but like The Good House, for instance, doesn't necessarily take place there. And she can still do that so well, which is a talent. And you're right that her characters are so rich. But one thing that I was thinking about, and Mel, this may be in the same essay that I had that you were referring to when she was talking about like reading Mama Day and Toni Morrison and her like early influences on her work. I think it was it I had read one, and I think it might have been the same in the same one, because she talked about that as well. But she talks about genre writing quite a bit, and like not only wanting to explore like big themes, but wanting to scare people. And she also mentioned another writer who, I mean, makes sense, but she was talking about Anne Rice in particular, because I think a lot of people looked at her and said, why, why are you writing about like supernatural stuff? With the implication being, why are you wasting your time? And she says that she had a chance to interview Anne Rice. And when she asked her about the critics who were essentially saying the same thing to Anne Rice, saying like, why was she wasting her writing talent writing about vampires? That Rice ended up saying, well, if I'm writing about immortals, I can talk about like the big things in life. You know, all the big things in life, because they experience it all for so long. And do talking about that being kind of a turning point for her in her writing, because in this essay she talks about how, you know, she was writing a certain type of story, and then through I'm being careful with my words here, but kind of what academics can do to a person, where it kind of took everything that was her out of her stories for a while, and she ended up trying to emulate a lot of the like white male writers that she was reading at the time in school. And I don't think it did her work any justice. And at some point she realized she kind of had to go back to like what she wanted to write about. But it was this moment talking to Anne Rice, I think that was really like at least she talks about it being a turning point, because she realized she could combine her love for horror and her love for supernatural with a lot of the big themes she wanted to explore, which, you know, growing up with civil rights activists as parents, she was really steeped in that kind of in those kind of themes, that she was already looking at the world through a particular viewpoint, and so she started kind of combining those really well. But it's just funny because I think about so many of the horror writers that I love and respect, whether it's Stephen King has written about that I think in On Writing, and his book about the horror genre, Dance Macabre. I feel like he wrote about that, saying that he had writing teachers and other writers say, like, why are you wasting your time writing these silly little stories, these genre stories, when you could be writing literature? I'm using air quotes there. But Anne Rice came up against those critics. Tananrive Due came up across these critics. And I've even heard people today still talking about that. I've heard Stephen Graham Jones, for instance, on several panels talk about people saying that. And it's just funny to me that we're still having these conversations within the horror genre, like as if we're still having to defend ourselves against it. That you can't, like, that somehow the supernatural and these kind of big, lofty themes, like love or death or the meaning of life or racism or gender inequality, like that can't all happen within the same story as ghosts and vampires. Anyway, she does it really well. That's what I'm trying to say, is in particular, she does it really well, of blending all those things.
Well, and I think that, just to build off what you're saying, I think that also connects her to another writer that she talks about a lot, and says that she wished that she had read their work earlier, and that's Octavia Butler, who Stephen Barnes knew really well, and kind of, I guess Butler was almost kind of like a mentor to him in a way. And Tananrive Due and her husband have a podcast. They talk about the craft of writing, and it's really fascinating. And they do a lot of cool interviews. And they played at one point a recording of an interview that they had done with Butler many years ago, that they did a little bit of editing on and played. And it was just fascinating to hear Butler talk about these things that you're talking about, Lisa, and that is, writing about real life important issues and in the guise of a genre in a way, and people not understanding the importance of that you can write science fiction and still deal with these important issues, just like you can write horror and still deal with these important issues. You don't need to have straight up realism to do that. So I feel like that's another kind of interesting connection in the genre field.
Well, why don't we? I completely agree with you, Mel, on that. And I like that connection to Octavia Butler too, because in my mind, those two authors complement each other really well. I think Octavia Butler and Tananrive Due are absolutely on the same kind of level. Well, why don't we take a minute, since we've kind of talked a little bit about what she does, why don't we kind of round robin this and talk about, like, if you were going to talk to somebody and give them one story or novel to start with, like, this is your Tananrive Due starter, what would your recommendation be?
Oh my gosh, that's so hard. Because I just want to be like, read all of it. Okay, I'm gonna cheat a little bit and have two. So I have now used Patient Zero in the classroom a couple times, and the students love it, and it inspired them to try to seek out more. Which, listeners, if Lisa and I talked about Patient Zero, I believe, on the Monster She Wrote podcast, like a little over a year ago. But it's a pandemic apocalyptic tale, but it's focused from the point of view of a young child who people think is Patient Zero, and all the issues that he has, of course, with that, and how that changes his life. And you kind of figure out what's going on outside of where he's being kept because of his journal. He doesn't quite understand what's going on, but as adults reading the story, you get clues as to what's going on through that narration, that narrative point of view. For me personally, I was kind of, one of the first things I read, not the first thing, but one of the first things I read that kind of like I was like, oh, this is right in my wheelhouse, and I'm really loving this. Is the novella Ghost Summer? All the stories in Ghost Summer are great, but the novella Ghost Summer I really like because I'm into ghosts and the idea of what ghosts can do for haunting and telling stories that people maybe either don't know, the story, or they're trying to repress the story. And so Ghost Summer is interesting because again, it's from the perspective of a child who is obsessed with being a ghost hunter, like the ghost hunters on TV. And instead, he learns some really hard truths about the past and actually answer some questions from the past that people weren't able to answer before because, anytime a traumatic incident happens in the past of anyone or a community, no one is going to know the entire story. And so they put it together by oral history, history at the library, and then what he sees with the ghosts. And there's still kind of holes at the end. And the way she writes the idea of like, we're going to go ghost hunting, like what you see on TV, and it becomes so visceral. And the way that she breaks down the layers of history, it's just so fascinating. It's like you were saying earlier, Matt. It's like the themes, I guess, of Toni Morrison with the character and setting development, maybe of Stephen King. I guess I don't know. It's hard to tell where it's all coming from because, of course, there's also just Dude's an amazing writer. But those two, I think, Patient Zero seemed to draw the students really into it. But then, like for me, if I knew someone was interested in the supernatural, I would probably go with Go Summer.
I'll go with, and it's a tough question. So thanks for the hard question, Lisa. But I'll probably go with the first one that I read by her, which really I feel like sucked me into her world and writing. But that was My Soul to Keep, which it's the first of the series for the African Immortals, which the second one is very different thematically, even though it's still very much following the same characters. And so I feel like they are two very distinct novels, but still within the same world that she's created. But My Soul to Keep is, there are, well, let me back up, I guess. The basic premise is it kind of cuts between two different characters. Mostly you're in the viewpoint of Jessica, and she's a woman she's married to a man named David. They have a daughter together, and I mean they're just like a perfect blissful marriage. But of course, David has a secret, and uh, I don't feel like it's any spoiler what with it being called the African Immortals series to show that David's actually immortal. Well, he wasn't born immortal. He's, if I remember correctly, about 400 or 500 years old. But he and a group of other men were involved in a ritual and became immortal. And one thing that's really interesting about the story is that because it alternates their viewpoints, you see David's point of view, who he is very deeply in love with her, even though he knows that he will long outlive her. But some of the choices that he makes to kind of protect his secret are also just things that are kind of horrifying. But in the end, he does make the decision that he wants to spend the rest of his life with her, not her life, his life. And I won't give any spoilers as to how that ends up, but I feel like her reaction on finding out about the secret, which she finds out I think midway through the novel, if I remember correctly, is like the way it's written is perfect. Because I mean, she is absolutely floored and stunned because there's this huge secret that's been kept from her. And so it's almost like, this person that she knew and had loved and had been married to for years, I mean, was he even the same person? Was this all an act? I mean, all of these things come out, but they she handles it so well by not hitting you over the head with those questions, but having Jessica kind of come to these realizations without, I don't know how to explain it, but it's subtly done in the book so that it doesn't feel like all of these deeper questions are like slapping you across the face with exposition, I guess, if that makes sense. But on top of that, there are a couple of scenes in that book that just stick with me. The opening chapter involves their dog getting sick and in the middle of the night and having to be put down, and like that chapter just sticks with me. Like I can't shake it from my head. There's also the chapter where David reveals his secret to her by literally showing how he can't die, basically killing himself in front of her and coming back to life, is horrifyingly done, but in a good horrifying way, I guess. But and then there's kind of the climax of the novel, which again, I'm not going to spoil that for any of you who haven't read it, but those three scenes in particular just like live on in my head. They stuck with me long after I finished the book, and even still now, just thinking about them, like they're so well written, and that just it sticks with you. So it's really got this interesting feel to it, though, where I mean, it feels kind of like it has these horror aspects, but it's not a full on like scare you constantly novel either. There are these other deeper themes that she's exploring, and I really like that about it too. So that would be my recommendation. But also, that being said, full disclosure, I have not read Ghost House. I do own it, but I have not read that one yet. That is very high in my to be read pile. So I know that that one has very, very high, very highly regarded. So that answer may change once I've read that book. So just, put a little asterisk there. Uh, but but as of right now, I would say My Soul to Keep.
Those two scenes, Matt, are so memorable. They're memorable for me as well. And I would say there's thriller aspects in that book too, because of the pursuits that happen.
Yes, yes, there
Yeah.
absolutely are. I would 100% agree with that. It definitely has like the vibe of a thriller, but
And
deeper.
the cat named Tea Cake, is that from Their Eyes Were Watching God? I wonder.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I don't think there would really be any other explanation for a cat named Tea Cake for sure.
And Tea Cake is an awesome character.
In both books, actually.
Ooh. Sorry, Lisa. I didn't mean to jump in there. I had to shout out Tea Cake.
No, I completely understand. No, I find this discussion really funny because I think we're all going to have different different viewpoints because I would be tempted to say Patient Zero, Mel, as you did. It's one of my favorite short stories, just period. And I think if you want just kind of a taste of what Tananarive Due can do, that's a good place to start. I would definitely recommend The Good House, which is again one of my all-time favorite stories. So The Good House is about this woman named Angela Toussaint who lives in Los Angeles. She's a lawyer, and she spends her summers in Sacagawea, Washington, or she did. Yes, where she was raised by her grandmother, and now she owns the house, and she used to go back there with her family. But then there's a big tragedy that happens, and she doesn't want to go back to the house anymore, but she's kind of forced to. At some point, she returns back there and basically finds that the house, which is known as the Good House by the townspeople of Sacagawea, because it's got this like history of like her grandmother being this kind of like a magical healer, almost a history of that kind of house, and so they call it the Good House, and that's what it's known as. But when Angela actually goes back, she's divorced, she's got a teenage son. When she goes back, she's kind of forced to deal with not only the tragedy that she has had in her own life. And I'm trying to avoid spoilers because there's some stuff that happens in the book that's really just gut wrenching. But when she's forced to kind of go back, she's forced to deal with her own kind of trauma and tragedy in her own life, but also the history of the house, the history of like who her grandmother was, this kind of supernatural entity that may or may not be haunting the house itself, how that plays into like the town that the house sits in and how the townspeople feel about her and her family, and this kind of idea of she gets really nuanced with the idea of, I think, racial politics in small towns, which is really, I think, kind of interesting. And I really hadn't read too much like that in a horror story. It's got some terrifying moments. That the book is scary. Like, I will tell you, just as a haunted house story, I don't know if you could pay me to sleep in the good house to spend the night there. Like it's a scary story. It's full of like mood and atmosphere and tension and suspense. So it's got kind of those classic haunted house tropes that I think you expect from the genre, but she does so much more with it. And I think it really shows, well, that and Patient Zero, which is the pandemic story that Mel was talking about. Both of those, I think, show how she can take like a tried and true trope in the genre and kind of turn it on its head. But also, like, her horror isn't built around just like ghosts haunting a house, right? She knows how to make you care about characters because they feel so real and the relationships feel so real. Like every marriage she's written about that I've read feels like a real marriage. Every like mother-child relationship feels like a real mother-child relationship. Like the characters feel real. And so when things happen to them, even if it may not be supernatural, whatever is happening, it feels gut-wrenching watching things that they go through. Again, I'm talking very vaguely here because if you haven't read it, you need to kind of go in and just experience what happens in the book. But there's some great turns and twists in that book that I think are really well earned, but also a lot of fun. So if you like haunted houses, again, this is one of my favorite. It's probably definitely my top 10 of like my favorite horror novels just of all time. So I would definitely recommend starting with The Good House by Tananrive Due. But if you don't want, maybe if haunted houses aren't your thing, or if you want something a little shorter, definitely go for Patient Zero. That's a great one as well. But yeah, that would be my recommendation. Well, all I have to say is that after talking about Tananrive Due and talking so much about The Good House just now, I just want to go back and reread that book. Like that's really the only thing I'm thinking about. So I don't know, maybe this is a good place for us to kind of end this general introduction to Tananrive Due. We will be back in a couple of weeks with a new episode, and we're going to kind of continue our discussion of Tananrive Due by looking at a specific short story. But if you've read Due, or maybe if you haven't and you're interested in reading her now, we would love to hear that. So reach out to us. Of course, we're across social media. We're at No Fear Cast on Twitter and Instagram. We also have a Facebook page. Our email is nofearcast@gmail.com. If you love what we're doing, consider supporting us on Patreon. It's completely stopped right now. I will go ahead and say that as of the recording of this, that we are not doing any updating our minis right now, but we do have 6 seasons worth of mini episodes that will be unlocked once you join our Patreon to support us. So there's a lot of kind of past content that you can shift through. So that's something that would help us out tremendously if you wanted to do that. Of course, if you can't, we understand not everybody is at the point where they can just donate money to things that they enjoy. But if you cannot do that, we would appreciate if you would rate and review us just on whatever podcast app you are listening to. It is entirely free for you, but it does help other listeners find us. Thanks again for listening. Theme music is by Nicholas Gasparini. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode.